Middle managers are not disappearing because they suddenly became bad at their jobs. They are disappearing because the modern enterprise is redesigning itself around direct visibility, direct tooling, and direct accountability. For decades, the middle layer existed for a simple reason. Organizations were blind without it. Strategy moved downward in fragments. Execution moved upward as stories. The manager in the middle converted messy reality into a coherent narrative leadership could act on. That translation was the value. But translation is only valuable when the original signal is hard to access. That condition is collapsing. Work now happens inside systems that already measure it. Tickets, commits, call logs, revenue attribution, churn cohorts, customer sentiment, exception queues, service-level breaches, fraud flags, compliance trails. A large part of knowing what's going on has moved from people's heads into instrumentation. Once the work is instrumented, coordination stops being a human monopoly. This is why the first failure is not performance, it is leverage. A middle manager's historic leverage came from three things: privileged context, privileged access, and privileged sequencing. They saw more than individual contributors, they knew more than executives, and they controlled the order in which information arrived. When you control sequencing, you control decisions. That is what made the role durable. AI doesn't have to be smart to erode that leverage. It just has to be present in the workflow. The moment prioritization is assisted by models and status is surfaced automatically, the manager loses the ability to be the bottleneck. The system doesn't ask permission to surface an exception, it escalates. The system doesn't wait for a weekly update, it refreshes. The system doesn't require an interpretation layer to identify drift, it detects drift statistically. The uncomfortable part is that this can look externally like a cultural shift. We're flattening, we're empowering ICs, we're moving faster. Those phrases sound like a leadership philosophy. In practice, they're often an accounting outcome. If the organization can run the same throughput with fewer coordination nodes, finance will eventually notice. And when finance notices, the narrative becomes inevitable. Here's what structural redundancy looks like in the real world. A director used to need 4 managers because each manager maintained a separate slice of context. Now a single director can watch the same slices through a consolidated operating dashboard. A product org used to need managers to reconcile competing signals from sales, support, and engineering. Now the signals are stitched together automatically, and the conflicts surface as explicit trade-offs. A support team used to need managers to triage because triage required reading the room. Now triage is assisted, routed, and QA'd by policy and pattern recognition. Notice what's missing in all of that. It's not people, it's waiting. AI removes the delay between a signal and an action. It removes the time that used to justify a role whose core function was to compress uncertainty for someone else. If you're a time-poor US professional earning $120,000 and trying to protect your relevance, that's the key insight. Organizations don't eliminate roles because they're mean. They eliminate roles when the role's primary output becomes latency. Middle managers are especially exposed because their value proposition is often coordination without ownership. They supervise work they don't produce. They represent outcomes they don't fully control. They manage risk by managing narrative. In a world where risk is increasingly modeled and narrative is increasingly automated, that shape becomes difficult to defend. This is why you'll see a quiet expansion of span of control before you see a formal middle management reduction. Teams don't get told, "We're removing the layer." They get told, "We're simplifying reporting lines." One manager becomes 2, 2 becomes 1. A senior IC becomes team lead without the promotion. A director absorbs another group temporarily. The word temporary is doing a lot of work. A second-order effect follows immediately. Career ladders compress. Middle management was not only an operational layer, it was a progression layer. It provided narrative space for advancement. It gave professionals a way to be seen without owning a full business outcome. When that layer thins, titles can remain while authority shrinks. People keep the meetings, but lose the decisions. They keep the responsibility, but lose the leverage. That is a brutal combination because it produces stress without power. There's also a psychological trap. Professionals assume that if they perform well, the organization will need them. That logic made sense when the organization needed a person to move information. It breaks when the organization needs a system to move information. Your performance can be strong and still be irrelevant to a redesigned workflow. That is what makes this wave different from the old layoffs. The old layoffs targeted failure or cost. This wave targets topology. It targets the structure of how work flows. Topology changes are sticky. Companies don't rebuild layers once they discover they can operate without them. They don't reintroduce overhead once feedback loops tighten. They don't add approvals once policy and instrumentation handle risk. Even when hiring returns, the layer often doesn't. The organization doesn't miss it because it learned to route around it. So what does survival look like in this environment? It's not about becoming louder or defending old titles. It's about migrating toward roles with defensible leverage. That usually means one of two paths. Ownership, end-to-end responsibility for an outcome no dashboard can absorb. Or system design, shaping the rules, workflows, and constraints that let teams operate without constant coordination. In short, you either own the scoreboard or you design the game. If you sit in the middle and your primary contribution is alignment, treat that as a warning label. Alignment is valuable, but it is also one of the first things automated once visibility is shared and priorities are computed continuously. The system doesn't need alignment when everyone sees the same signal. Most professionals believe layoffs target failure. In reality, they increasingly target friction. And in an AI-instrumented organization, friction is defined by steps the system can bypass. Middle management is not being attacked, it is being bypassed.